Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I am a published fantasy author and a professional writer/editor for over 10 years. Now, I usually do this podcast a little bit more often, but I went on a little bit of a vacation over the weekend, and so I didn't have a lot of extra time this past week. So, getting fewer episodes, but that's okay because, you have the whole archive. You can always go back and listen to an episode that you haven't listened to yet. I actually don't know how many people have listened to every single episode. I doubt it. I mean, that's a lot of stuff. But hopefully those of you who have listened to more than one episode are getting something out of this podcast. And I really appreciate all of you who have been subscribing, who have been leaving comments and reaching out to us. It means a ton. It's really nice to see as well. But I don't want to dwell on that. I want to get into the fantasy writing advice. So our producer, Natalia Emmons, has sent me a prompt, once again, from the Fantasy Writers subreddit on reddit.com. I'm going to go through this prompt here, and I am reading it for the first time. I have no idea what it's about yet. But at the end of the show, since I am going to be talking off the cuff, our other producer, Bridget Surdock, is going to give me some notes and fact-checking as needed. All right, so this comes to us from user JesterJester8443. Jester writes that they want some feedback for their character idea. I know this is fun. This is a science fiction. Okay, yeah, we haven't done a ton with science fiction yet, so it'll be nice to kind of get into that. I know not all of you are writing sci-fi, but I'm sure a lot of whatever feedback we're about to give here is going to be applicable across genres, at least in some ways. All right, so Jester writes, I've been coming up with this protagonist who is an alien android bounty hunter, but I think he's too overpowered. His name is Sealgare. The name is in Celtic, which means hunter. He is made up of tiny nanobots that are perfectly blended with organic and inorganic matter. Grown as in embryo with nanomachines as he developed in a chamber. As a result, he has the ability to shapeshift into any type of weapon or gadget once scanned. He can survive up to a year without food or oxygen and the ability to self-repair when injured. He prefers to be efficient above all else when he's collecting bounties. Always strikes for vitals with his X-ray vision. He even has thermal vision to when X-ray fails. Able to calculate the trajectory of moving objects regardless of distance and acceleration. He comes up with multiple contingency plans for every situation. His only weakness is a prolonged exposure to extreme heat and corrosive acid. Is there anything else I can do to even the playing field? He still feels overpowered. All right, so I think the first thing I'm going to say to this is that you kind of have the Superman problem, right? With Superman, he has an arbitrary weakness, which is kryptonite. The whole point of that is there needs to be something that weakens him at some point. So kryptonite is always kind of just this lingering thing that exists. And when you really examine the Superman story, however, that's not his real weakness. Superman's real weakness is that he has all of this power, but it is not enough to protect the people that he loves. His weaknesses tend to come from within. They tend to stem from the nature of whatever story Superman is in. Just look at the Man of Steel movies, right? The whole point of that movie is like, yes, he is like a god. And so Zack Snyder is trying to tell a story about, he's trying to mirror like the Greek gods' myths and how they want to be more human. They want to be loved and respected, but they have so much power that they are feared, right? And so that movie is sort of about how somebody with all this power tries to find a way to help the world without, putting the world in this state of perpetual paranoia. Now, I don't think that movie does that very effectively, in my opinion, but you can see this all over media. And sometimes these characters are the villains, right? Look at the Terminator. In Terminator, in the first movie, the Terminator is just like all powerful. It can do a lot of the things you're mentioning here. It's super efficient. It's very cold. It doesn't really have its only weakness really is like extreme heat, right? The lava and all that. And so the way to beat it is to just kind of run away from it and be lucky. And so you can have a story where if that's your protagonist, then the weakness there is that the villain or the antagonist is the underdog. And so you almost have the audience kind of rooting for the person who has the weakness. Or you can do Terminator 2, which is that, their competition is a more advanced model. It's something that has even more abilities. I would say that based on what you wrote too, that the shape-shifting thing, that reminds me more of the Terminator 2. sort of character. So all that to say, it's okay to have an overpowered character, but it does have to tie into your story. The thing that you don't want to run into is that you don't want your character you don't want to code them as an underdog. You don't want to code them as just this kind of like character who's scrapping by, but then is so powerful that it breaks the immersion, because then the reader is like for example, if Star-Lord from Guardians of the Galaxy, if he had all of these amazing abilities, then that character wouldn't work, because the point of Star-Lord is that he has a lot of weaknesses. He's kind of crass. He can, be clever in a pinch and all of that. But if you started giving him all these like incredible powers, he would just be Ultron. And Ultron does not work as Star-Lord within the same context of the movie. You have to change the story to adapt to what your character is capable of. Something, I guess, you mentioned Bounty Hunter, right? The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian is kind of overpowered in some ways, not as overpowered as your character, but a lot of what the Mandalorian has to get right is that you have this character who is very competent. He's a great bounty hunter. He's very cold. The story, though, is about how it's not about him winning the day. It's not about him winning every fight and getting through every obstacle. It's really about him finding belonging and, being able to accept that, he can love something that isn't his tribe. He can, build a community in a very lonely, cold galaxy. That's the kind of thing that makes that story stand out, at least in the first 2 seasons, I'd say. So again, you can find a way to do this. It's all about the story, right? And if you wanted to just throw in some weaknesses arbitrarily, then you could do the thing that The Wild Robot does, those books, but also the movie that just came out. And in The Wild Robot, first of all, that story, again, it's not about a robot just trying to win a bunch of fights. It's trying to, at first, it's like trying to like make its way in the wilderness and trying to kind of do the Superman thing, like not be feared or like, just wants to help. But one of the weaknesses of that character in that movie, and I believe in the book as well, is that they have a limited power source. And also they are beholden to this kind of shady, evil corporation. And so, whatever could happen to them would, with your alien bounty hunter, for example, you say that they're an android. Who created them? There could be some intrigue. There could be an emotional weakness there for whoever created it. You could take that back to Rocket Raccoon. Rocket Raccoon's very arrogant, and that arrogance comes from, and also, doesn't want to be captured and is always escaping because that's their trauma, the way that they were captured and they lost everyone they loved and all that. So but then again, in The Wild Robot, the power source and like being able to like survive and all that is also important. So if your character has this kind of like weakness that has to do with like what power is it, that could also be interesting. There's all kinds of things that you can do. But I think that, if you're coming to people with feedback about this aspect, it feels a little bit cart before the horse. It feels a little bit like, you're thinking about logistics and details like this, when I think a lot of this sort of thing should tend to come about like when you were developing the stakes of the story. And if you don't have a lot of that mapped out and you're just focusing on the character, I would maybe take a step back and make sure you've really taken a look at your premise, the premise of the whole story and what really drives the story, because that's going to be the best thing to indicate what your actual weaknesses for the character are going to be, whether they be external, emotional, physical, whatever. Because like, for example, if you're trying to devise this story, you have this overpowered bounty hunter, and then you have an inciting incident, they have to be put into a situation that is more overwhelming. And whatever that weakness is, let's say it is the power source thing, you want that to tie thematically to the point of the story. What powers humanity? You want to find like little things like that make sense. Whatever it is, you want it all to tie into the plot. You want to tie it into what this character is actually up to, because then you can sort of derive its basics. I think that you are maybe starting in the wrong place here in terms of your story development, just based on the sense I'm getting. I could be wrong, of course. But yeah, it just seems like you're trying to figure out aspects of a character and then maybe figure out what they do. And that's not the way to do it. I think the way to do it is you want to have like a rough sketch, I guess, of the character, but that should be coinciding with how you're developing the actual story. And if you have developed a bit of a premise, then let that do more work to inform what your character's downfalls are, what really brings them. Because the thing that you really want to avoid, and I'll end with this, the thing that you want to avoid is that it feels like the character can just get out of any situation. There's not a lot of tension in the story. They're super powerful, and all your story is about is, we got to go save the thing. The thing is, these people are attacking. Please, alien bounty hunter, go stop them. And they go, and then they stop them, and it's not that hard, or if, you just write an action scene where it's like, oh, maybe they got punched in the face, but they made it through. That's not very exciting. It's just not, especially in a written medium. You want the story to feel more electric. You want people turning pages. And the thing to get people turning pages is for them to emotionally invest in your character. You make them super overpowered, but what's the emotional engagement? What's that real hook to like what makes this character special and different from what we've seen before? That's the thing you need to figure out first and foremost. Okay. So, and yeah, this applies to fantasy. I mean, I haven't really, I used sci-fi examples on purpose, but that, in that sense, you know, it's okay because sci-fi has its own kind of flair, and this applies to fantasy too, I think, a lot. All right, so let's look at some of the comments here. Let's see what other people had to say. A New Siberian was reacted to this line. So Jester said, I think he's too overpowered, and New Siberian replies, you're aware that you're the writer, right? If a character doesn't work, you can just change them. Yeah, I think they're aware that they're the writer, New Siberian. Like, they're asking for help to change them. That's a very pointless comment. I mean, it feels a little bit snarky, and I don't understand like why they felt like they needed to weigh in. You know, like, yeah, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to change the character and make them less overpowered. Yeah, got it. Pre-Jackpot writes, you don't need to worry about game balance when writing fiction. I kind of disagree, but okay. The question is whether you're telling an interesting story. If you're writing exciting action scenes where your character is mowing through legions of stormtroopers, readers who want that kind of thing will enjoy it, even if they don't really have any doubt about who will win. And on the other hand, nanomachine powers might not help your loner bounty hunter be less confused if he suddenly finds himself for the first time with a group of friends who care about him. And X-ray vision might not help him find love. Yeah, I mean, that's a basic way of like what I'm saying too. I think also they're alluding to this kind of like power fantasy, wish fulfillment type of fantasy, very popular with light novels and anime, where you have a character who is like beaten down in the very beginning, like bullied, very loner, very like nobody likes me, I don't have any whatever. But then they get isekai'd or something, they get sent to another world, and then all of a sudden they have like a cheat code and they are just like all powerful. They're the strongest. These stories tend to work for two reasons. There are readers and anime watchers who like that kind of wish fulfillment. There's an audience for it. It's not huge in the West, but it is in Japan. And you know, it's growing, of course, in the West because Americans, we love our anime. But in terms of like that kind of power fantasy, usually what they end up doing to mix things up is they like make it more about the character trying not to lose themselves. And like, okay, they have all this power. What do they do with it? A lot of this stuff I've already mentioned. And so I guess I should do like one example. The examples I'm thinking of are not great anime or light novels, quite honestly. I'm thinking the first one I thought of was, well, I'm not going to mention that one because I think that's a guilty pleasure of mine. I'm thinking of Failure Frame. But a better one, a one that's more of a crowd pleaser, I guess, is The World's Greatest Assassin. I forget the full name. It's a very Japanese kind of like, the world's greatest assassin was reincarnated as a blah, blah, blah. And that one's about a guy who was an old, like 50s, 60s, like professional assassin who was like incredible at, you know, assassinating. And he dies. He's like betrayed and stuff, but then he is sent to a fantasy world after, I think, reincarnated in a fantasy world with the task of assassinating this like powerful hero. And he is extremely competent. I mean, he is just like so overpowered, you know, like more so overpowered that the most overpowered character in the story finds him impressive. The reason that story works though is because it's about him making connections with people and trying to turn that side of him off, this like side of him that is this assassin. So that's a great reference point if you are curious, Chester, into an example of a story that kind of does this with a bit of a colder, you know, not bounty hunter necessarily, but somebody who's kind of in that like sketchy world, you know. Roudmar said, he's super OP in my honest opinion, but if the story is about making a girl love him, I don't see any problem with that or making friends. Jester replied, the story is about him learning to be more than his purpose as the ultimate hunter and learning to feel emotions and empathy. Yeah, and so here, that was my first thought, is like, that's probably what you're going with. Be careful here, because it's very, very overdone. We've seen a lot of this type of story before, and not that it can't be done, but you really need to work hard to find a fresh angle for it. You know, the whole idea of like a robot, you know, trying to overcome its programming, and I know it's an android, but still, and not just trying to be a hunter. I mean, again, it's just like The Mandalorian. It's a little bit too much like The Mandalorian, honestly. So you need to work on this. You need to find a way to kind of make this stuff feel yours even more so. And so it'll be yours because you're writing it. I understand that, of course, but yeah, you want to make sure that when you are trying to sell the book and you're trying to bring your story to other people, they don't just write it off before they give it a chance. Gleese Dragon writes, there's not much of a character here. A power set and the expected assassin combat tactics, sure, but no personality. And judging by the way you're stating this, you think this guy is super duper awesome, which makes me think you're really likely to give this guy's coolness and dignity plot armor. Both of those are much bigger indicators that this character will read as overpowered and bland than the specific list of powers. Basically, characters are interesting when who they are matters to the plot. Their personality, their values, their relationships with other people, When a character's primary way of interacting with the plot is just applying their toolkit of flashy powers and other discrete skills, it's just meh. All toolkit is only really fun in games, where the mechanical loop of gameplay is often primary, but it loses so much appeal when it's not interactive. Something funny with toolkit stuff is that when you've got an actual character in a plot that their toolkit skills can't solve, you can have hilariously overpowered characters while still having actual narrative stakes. For example, Sun Wukong in Journey to the West is a redundantly immortal warrior sorcerer monkey, and very often in situations where brute force just won't work. An opponent knows his reputation and nopes out of the fight. His traveling companion objects to senseless murder and is the guy in charge. The situation is social over martial. It says something that he reads more as a trickster who has to deal with problems very laterally, despite having mountain-shattering combat powers. Second, when the author thinks that a character is the coolest thing ever, they're likely to shy away from actually challenging them, and a character who's never in a situation where they're vulnerable or goofy or whatnot is boring. Unflappably awesome can't really sustain a good plot, and treating a power fantasy character with kid gloves makes them even blander. Overall, my challenge is this. Describe this character without any reference to their powers or their job. Who they are, not what's written on their stat screen. And Jester responded to this and said, that is true, I didn't put his personality in the post, because I didn't think that it was important to the topic at hand, but understandable, thank you. Yeah, so I agree with quite a lot of this, and I like that example of Journey to the West. It's a really great example. It made me think, too, of The Legend of Korra. And now, a lot of you have probably are aware of watched Avatar The Last Airbender. And Avatar The Last Airbender, Aang was the Avatar, right? The whole point of that story was he had to learn how to become overpowered, basically. At the start, he's not really, super combative. He would rather just kind of avoid fighting. And so the story is more about him getting stronger, but also about him, being accepted and, building this community with his friends and all that. Legend of Korra was really great because it turned that on its head. In this case, we had a fully realized Avatar. Well, almost. She had one element to go. But otherwise, Korra was extremely powered. She was basically the strongest character for a lot of that show. There was one character who was kind of like this, mysterious, murderous, in the first season. But really, once you get to the second, third, and fourth seasons, Korra's she's the show. She is just super powerful. But that is another case where brute force didn't always work for her. And that was part of her character, is that she just wanted to firebend her way out of every situation, just try to, beat somebody up, and that'll convince them to change their mind. But that show is so much more about the ideologies that she was combating with. It was her challenging, hey, the world is messed up. The status quo doesn't work for everybody. But Korra was able to kind of look at that and say, all right, but that doesn't mean we need fascism. That doesn't mean we need, anarchy. She was a character who just became not stronger, but smarter. She became smarter, and she became more self-aware. What's the word? Self-actualized. That's the word I'm thinking of. Where it was more about her gaining wisdom. It was more about her kind of getting to the place where Aang really was as an airbender, and learning how to be content with the fact that power isn't everything. And a story can definitely come along those lines. Now, for an alien bounty hunter, you kind of have a different setup there, right? Again, it's going to be your own thing, but you should investigate that, right? Investigate the stories that have been done before. See for yourself, what about this character? I know they said they left the personality out for a reason. They kind of mention it's a little bit of a cold character, a little bit of a shoot now, ask questions later sort of thing. But there are so many avenues you can go down with this. You can have a Han Solo type of bounty hunter. Well, he's not a bounty hunter, but you know what I mean. He's smarter. But you know what I mean? The character is a bit more of an outlaw. There's all kinds of archetypes you can do. I know I talked about this in our How to Write Female Protagonists episode. That one little hack, if you aren't totally sure how you want to set up the character or frame the character, and I think Jester already is kind of there. But for the rest of you, I'd say as a reminder, a quick little thing you can do is take a character you really like, or a character you think this character is kind of sort of like, and just try to take a few things away from their personality and add a few things. So you have a starting point. It's not like you are trying to make something completely from scratch, but you have like a baseline. And eventually your character is going to come through once you do a little work with that. So, all right. Well, that should do it for this little roundup. I'm going to turn it over to Bridget Surdock now to make sure I didn't say anything too egregious. I don't think I said anything wrong, but that's what we have Bridget for. So don't go away. I'll be right back. And we're back. All right. We have quite a few notes here from producer Bridget. I love it. And I think judging by the tone of some of these notes, looks like Bridget is very happy that we are getting into sci-fi or science fiction territory. For those of you who haven't listened to an episode where it's been brought up, Bridget is very science-minded, very intelligent, just much better at that sort of thing than I am. Bridget's the person who, whenever I work on a new project, I definitely rely a lot on Bridget. Thank you, Bridget, for helping me get some of the details right when it comes to tech and stuff like that, because that is not my wheelhouse. But anyway, Bridget writes, first off, I agree with everything you said and some of the commenters. It's hard to tell if the character is overpowered by just looking at a list of abilities. Without knowing the plot of the character any better, there's no way to really know if that's overpowered or not. If the plot is a cozy romance, he's perfectly fine. If he's leading an underdog rebellion against some empire, he's probably overpowered. Yeah, and one of the things I want to add to this, it kind of occurred to me more after I finished recording, is that when you do have a character who is hyper competent, just really powerful and can do a lot of, intense things, a nice way to make that character more plausible and more memorable and likable is to give them a contradiction, right? So if they are a cold alien bounty hunter, find something about them, maybe something that they do or a character quirk that is not what you would typically expect from that type of character archetype. So a good example of this would be One Piece has a lot of this. Like One Piece has a character named Virgo, who is this like stern, tall, really brutal Marine agent guy, a vice admiral, I think he was. And he's like always frowning. He's tough. He's strong. But he has this weird quirk where food always gets stuck to his face. And it's just very weird. But it's just kind of like a weird contradiction about him. Or another good example of this would be how, my character in one of my recent novels is like a very, kind of like into the supernatural, like dark arts and, very serious, a pirate, all this stuff, dangerous violence, but she loves to cook. Like you wouldn't really expect, a character like that to be so obsessed with like cooking and recipes and kind of cozy, heartwarming things. But like, people are complicated. People have a bunch of different paradoxes to them, and you can always find different things to bring a character alive in that way. You could take like an army soldier and it's like, okay, the typical Steve Rogers, Captain America soldier. But then you just add one kind of unexpected quirk to them. Like, oh, they always carry around the Quran. It's like, oh, this guy who looks like Steve Rogers is actually a Muslim. And that's not what you typically expect from like the, American, white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes kind of thing. Those little things can just make a character all of a sudden feel very alive because you're like, oh, I'm intrigued. Like, that's unexpected. That's something a little bit different. What else is going on with this person? So that's a very helpful thing to add to this. But anyway, Bridget writes, but also a number of those skills and abilities of his do leave some room for weaknesses. Superman only has a few weaknesses, kryptonite being the most well-known, but he's also weak to magic. Yes, Bridget is correct. I forgot about that. But what makes his stories so interesting is not his strength or physical weaknesses. It's his relationship to the people in his life. It's his balancing of being Superman and being Clark Kent. It's him having to rein in his strength. The I live in a world made of cardboard scene from Justice League, the animated series, really hits this note so well. But also, it's his villains. Specifically, it's Lex Luthor. And by the way, I know that scene Bridget is talking about, and it's this incredible moment with Superman where he just like lets loose for the first time, and it's phenomenal. And it's the kind of thing you can get away with when you've been building up a character a certain way, and you save that kind of moment for that kind of, But anyway, yes, Lex Luthor. Lex uses his intelligence and his wealth and his influence to work against Superman. He's Superman's arch nemesis and biggest threat, not because he's the strongest, but because he can outthink him. Yeah, this is one of those things that I think Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice really failed at. Jesse Eisenberg, I think he really tried. I like Jesse Eisenberg. His new movie, A Real Pain, is really good. But his version of Lex Luthor was just, it felt like a reaction to the character of Lex Luthor rather than a real outline of who that character is and what makes them tick. And, he has this like elaborate sort of plan, but he really is just kind of like the Joker. His plan doesn't make a lot of sense, and it doesn't really, it's not a plan that really gets the Superman of it all. And that's kind of what makes their relationship so interesting. Superman could kill Lex Luthor anytime he wants, really, but he can't because he has a code. And also Lex Luthor is so smart, he can get away with certain things. He's Teflon. And that's what makes him such a great villain, because you never know what he's going to do next. Anyway, so if you want your Superman-esque character to have a weakness, you have to outthink the abilities you give them. The protagonist is made up of tiny nanobots? Cool. The villain has their own nanobots that make his inert. Or there's an EMP that knocks them out of commission for a time. Yeah, and I would say like with the EMPs, you could do like the Matrix, you could do it as like a timer, or you have a set amount of time to set it, do it or whatever. I forget exactly how it worked in the Matrix actually, but yeah. He was made in a chamber and is half machine. He needs routine maintenance on a very strict schedule that gets more strict as he gets older. And if he puts it off too long, things will start to break down. Yeah, a great book that covers some of this is The Mechanical by Ian Trellis. Great book. Really, it's so fun with the way it tackles this kind of thing that Bridget's bringing up, of like stuff you wouldn't normally think of, right? And your sort of more glossy type of sci-fi. But also, I mean, Star Wars even has that. A lot of Star Wars, that world is very run down. You have characters all the time, like, oh, this droid is broken, I got to repair it. And like, oh no, the ship isn't, the gun isn't working, we got to go fix it. It's something that you don't hear people often talk about a lot in those Star Wars movies, but it's those little details that make them feel immersive. It feels like, oh yeah, I could plausibly be in this place because they are dealing with problems that make sense, but also are problems that I deal with. I always got something. Oh, my garage isn't working this week, I got to take care of that. And it's like, oh, it's causing all these issues. Like, that's relatable. Bridget writes, he can survive up to a year without food or oxygen. All right. What about water? Also, how does he do that? If he's still moving about, he'll need another source of energy. Could be photosynthesis or solar power or some other power, but it's less effective than regular food. So maybe he's at his weakest. Yeah, that's a great point. It's like, okay, he can survive. But again, the wild robot touches on this too. Like, that character has to essentially like shut down in order to conserve and basically like hibernate, which mimics kind of the animals of that place. And yeah, there's some interesting stuff that book/movie does with that character and their weaknesses. Bridget writes, the ability to self-repair, huh? Well, that doesn't stop him from getting hurt repeatedly. If he has X-ray and infrared vision, can he also see the visible light spectrum? X-ray vision works on bones because the light doesn't pass through bones. But if the creature he's hunting doesn't have bones, well, then he's screwed. Oh, that's a great point. See, I'm telling you all, Bridget is the one. Bridget's the one. You're like, Bridget, help. I have something that is complicated and technical, and I don't know what to do next. And so Bridget comes through. As for infrared, if you can get the atmosphere around you to be the same temperature as your body, or if you're cold-blooded, then he can't see you. Also, the difference in wavelength from infrared, 780 nanometers to 1 millimeter, to X-ray, 0.01 to 10 nanometers, is pretty sizable. Visible light is only 380 to 700 nanometers, which still leaves a big gap that certain life forms might be able to evade. Yeah, and I gotta be honest, I have no idea what any of this means, but I am reading it faithfully and with confidence the way that I would hope Bridget would want me to read it, because yes, that's all I can really do. Having multiple contingency plans does not mean he can predict everything that will happen. He will inevitably get things wrong. Yeah, just take a look at Batman. Since we talked about Superman, Batman is another character who is, hyper competent when it comes to planning, strategy, and things like that, but what can make Batman interesting is when all his money can't help him because he didn't anticipate something or his personal life gets in the way. And this was all just thought up while listening to this, all along with some quick Googling for light wavelengths. Yeah, I was going to say, Bridget, I mean, if you knew that in the back of your head, the wavelengths, that's pretty amazing. Bridget writes, so if OP wants to really give this guy weaknesses, they can take the time to think about it and break it down and figure out how the antagonist would work around these abilities. They can all be worked around on some level. But again, if the plot isn't some action adventure with big fight scenes and the worry of if the protagonist will survive or not, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful, and that's definitely, I think, some great added insight there. And there's so many great examples of this. I really think that when people say something is overpowered, it's a more specific complaint. I think the thing that you're probably worried about is that people aren't going to feel tension when they read the story. But again, tension comes from a lot of different things. If you don't want your character to be an underdog, that's fine. Not every character needs to have an underdog kind of character. But that does mean you have to do a different kind of story archetype or work around it. The story archetype being, of course, the character who seemingly has it all. What do you get the person who has everything? Well, sometimes the traumas, the things that they deal with just hit on a different level, Really investigate some of the classic bounty hunter stories that are out there, the ones that have inspired you maybe, and take a close look, investigate those stories and why they worked for you. What was it about this character? It probably wasn't, when the character just pulled out this like power you didn't know that they had and they beat down this strong opponent. It was probably when they managed to outsmart an opponent by thinking more cleverly and in a way that felt like the author was like a step ahead of you. That's the sort of thing specifically in sci-fi that you really want to nail down, because sci-fi, it's different from like the kind of typical fantasy. Sci-fi is your audience, your readers are going to have pretty high expectations when it comes to technical details, depending on the type of sci-fi you're doing. And not that fantasy doesn't have similar expectations, it's just usually around other things. And I think fantasy authors tend to get a pretty big pass when it comes to like second world stuff, because compared to space, space is just such a finicky thing that if you are going to break the rules there, you have to do it for a good reason. And anyway, I don't have to get into that tangent. Sci-fi is not my expertise, to be totally clear. And so that's why I didn't reference a lot of sci-fi books. I reference a lot of sci-fi movies, and that's for good reason. I think if I try to reference, some of my favorite sci-fi stuff, which is Isaac Asimov, like most people, Dune, of course, and a lot of that, it's probably just going to be stuff that's, a little bit more rote because I don't know that material inside and out. But anyway, hopefully this was helpful, and thank you, of course, producer Bridget, for all those great notes. Thank you, producer Natalia Emmons, for finding this prompt very fun to shake it up with some sci-fi stuff. And thank you, of course, the original poster here, Jester, for sending this prompt into the fantasy writers community, and hopefully we were a little helpful in some way. But all right, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget, if you have your own advice prompt, if you want to reach out about something that you're dealing with your story, just email us, fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com, which is in the show notes, or join the Discord, whatever you like. We also have our YouTube, which you can leave comments there. And we are, of course, an audio-only podcast for the time being. But all right, see you all on the next one, and be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.